Thanks, Brother David, and good morning to everyone. Good to catch up again down here. Yes, we're in a very difficult time in history, as we know, with all that's happening at the moment. I was reading just the latest thoughts that are happening around the world events, and at the moment they are now working on miniature nuclear bombs to put on the bottom of drones. Now, imagine what the complexity of that means as far as destruction in the world is concerned. So we're going to have a look at what is referred to as Gog and Magog. And it principally is referred to in the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel is one of the great books of the prophets. And of course, Ezekiel was also the high priest at the time of the captivity of the tribe of Judah when they're in Babylon. And so he wrote many things prophetically, but also he talked about the restoration of Jerusalem and things like that, because they were slaves under the Babylonians and from the time of Nebuchadnezzar. But we want to just today, I should say, identify Gog and Magog and how that the Bible gives us a picture of what's going to happen in the last days. Of course, one of the things I like to refer to is that in the book of Isaiah is that God establishes himself. And he says, remember the former things of old, that I am God. And this is the one thing that we can totally rely upon, is the word of God. And God is not a man that he should lie, nor the son of man that he should repent. And so we see the magnificence of our God in all that he created and recreated through the Holy Spirit when we're born again. But he goes on to tell us a bit about the prophetic side of things. When he says, there's none else, there's none like me. He says, declaring the end from the beginning. And that's why he's referred to, and in the title even of Christ, as he's the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And it says, from ancient times, the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. In other words, whatever man has in mind, the way that God has written and performed and has spoken of things that are going to happen in the world, it will happen the way that God says it will happen. And of course, one of the big things in recent history is the trouble in the Ukraine. And, even involved our own Prime Minister at one stage a little while ago, where he went over and he spoke with NATO at the NATO summit. And he spoke with Stoltenberg, who was the president of NATO. And of course, NATO's come to the fourth because of the situation in the Ukraine. And what that NATO has done is the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, and these are all the countries through Europe that are not really associated directly with Russia. And they've agreed, and this is going back a little while, but giving a little bit of history, that they would give military aid to heroic, as they call it, Ukraine, as US intelligence chiefs warns, that the war outlook in the Ukraine is rather grim. And here, now years later, the war is going on, and it hasn't stopped in any way at all. But it has united other nations together under NATO. And one of the things that the Russians were very concerned about was that the Ukrainian people would join in with NATO, because that means that when there's a need for support, under the obligations of NATO, they had to join together and support, like Ukraine, and fight against Russia. And so this has been a very difficult time. And so here we see a statement that was made in the press that NATO has branded Russia as the biggest direct threat to Western security after the invasion of the Ukraine, and agreed plans to modernise Kiev's beleaguered armed forces, saying this stood fully behind the Ukrainians' heroic defence of their country. And Stoltenberg has sort of brought it into play by making a statement and this is a couple of years or so ago now, had agreed to put 300,000 troops on high readiness from 2023, up from 40,000. So they had 40,000 troops between the nations. Now they've got over 300,000 as a new force to model to protect the area stretching from the Baltic Sea through to the Black Sea. So it's something that the nations of Europe are taking extremely seriously. And here we just see a comment about the Ukrainian war. It's back a couple of years now, but the principles are still the same. Here is Patrick Sanders, and he's in charge of the British Army, and he says, we're facing a 1937 moment with Russia. What he's saying in 1937, where everything started to become very apparent that there was going to be a war. The World War II started in 1939. And so the things that set it all up to start, he says, really we're in that stage at the moment in the world, the 1937 situation. And of course, this came as a result of the tension over Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. But one of the things he made a statement about is the British army must be prepared to engage in warfare at its most violent. In other words, he's letting it be known that if there is an out-and-out war, there probably won't be a war that has ever been compared to what would happen throughout Europe, as all the nations would be up against the move by the Russians. Of course, our friend Donald Trump came into the picture, and when he was getting into the position of becoming president, he made the statement that he would promise that he would end the Ukrainian-Russian war within one day. It didn't work, because he's dealing with the Russians. And now he says in the latest press, because everyone keeps reminding him about his statement, he says, oh, well, it was an exaggeration. And so Putin is, even at the moment, as they're trying to talk about things, and Trump says that he was a friend of Vladimir Putin, and, we're talking together. But Putin has made it very clear there'll be no change in the situation in attacking the Ukrainians, and only it will happen if it's on his terms. And so we find this situation right up to date, that nothing's changed because no one can really alter the situation. And so it just reminded me of a poem. I don't usually read poems very much these days, but this was written by Rudyard Kipling, one of the greatest poets at his time, and we're reading at the end of the 1800s. And he also was a great philosopher, and he was very interested in the affairs of mankind. And he wrote this poem, and and the title of it is "The Bear That Walks Like a Man." And it says, and when he stands up as pleading in wavering man-brute guise, when he veils the hate and cunning of his little swinish eyes, when he shows as seeking quarter, that is the time of peril, the time of the truce of the bear. And so he wrote that before there was any communism in Russia. It was actually at the time of the last Tsar Nicholas. But the message is, you can't trust Russia. And when you look at the background of this poem, it was actually written about a story of a hunter. And the hunter went out and cornered a bear. And of course, you're going to see later, if you knew, you might not realise that the symbolism of Russia is the bear. And so the bear is cornered by this hunter. He raises up his rifle and points it at the bear as the bear cowers and acts hurt. And in sympathy, for a moment, the hunter puts down his rifle as the bear wipes his face off with his claws. And that's the message that was written right back there. Be very careful if you're dealing with the bear. And so we come to Ezekiel 38. Ezekiel 38 has two principal names that we identify with Russia today. And that's the names of Gog and Magog. And of course, it all ties up, as we're going to show, with Russia, even in past events we will show about it. And the symbol is the hammer and the sickle. Gog and Magog. We'll identify them as we go through. But we want to go back to find out where some of the history is started from. I'm only giving a very brief outline. In the book of Genesis 25, and the Lord said unto her, Rebekah. Rebekah was the wife of Isaac. Isaac was the son of Abraham. And she had a struggle in her womb. It's in the book of Genesis 25, the whole story. There's a number of things in there that relate to what we're talking about today. And she had this struggle within her womb, and she went to inquire of the Lord. And this is what the Lord said to her. He said, 2 nations of people are in thy womb. In other words, you've got twins. And one's going to be one nation eventually, and one will be another nation eventually. And they'll be separated from thy bowels, and the one people shall be stronger than the other, and the elder of them will eventually serve the younger, which is an odd sort of a saying. This is before the children were even born. And it's going to identify nations of people ultimately. And so there were 2 sons, Jacob, who became known later as Israel, and Esau. Now we're mainly following the lineage today when we're talking about Gog and Magog of Esau. And we read here that Esau, in verse 25, said unto Jacob, Feed me, I pray thee, with that same red pottage, for I am faint, and therefore his name was called Edom. And this is a time when that Esau had been out in the field to hunt. He was a hunter, where Jacob was a plain man that dwelt in the tents. He didn't go out hunting like that Esau did. But he worked all day trying to get some venison or whatever it was, and he never obtained any. So when he came back, his brother's cooking up a red pottage. It was a stew of lentils, red lentils. And so he said, Feed me this day with that red pottage. And so he came identified with what he partook of. And the word Edom comes into the picture. We're going to point out that Esau is Edom, and Edom means red. So it's coming eventually to the red nation. And so what Jacob did very cunningly is that he wanted the blessing and the birthright with God and with his father as his descendant. And so we find that Esau, and we're reading a little bit later in the story, because he did give him the birthright. Because he said to him, Esau said to Jacob, what good is this birthright to me if I'm going to die because I'm so hungry? And so Jacob took advantage and he said, well, you give me your birthright, I'll give you the pottage. And he did. For a morsel of food, he sold his birthright, his relationship as the eldest of the 2 sons to God. And so he was the one who would have received the inheritance, but he didn't value the inheritance, and so he sold it in that sense for a morsel of food. But then when the time came for the blessing in chapter 27 of Genesis, that again it's a long story, but in actual fact, Jacob, supported by his mother Sarah, ended up giving the pottage that the father, Jacob or Israel, wanted, and covered him with fur because Esau was a hairy man and Jacob was a smooth man, as the saying is. And he went in and he tricked him because Israel, or Jacob at that time, was almost blind. And so he said, now bless me, my father. And so remember, he has the birthright because Jacob got that from Esau. Now he wants the blessing, which is really the blessing of God by inheritance. And so he tricked his father with the help of his mother into getting the blessing. Now Esau comes in and finds out the blessing's been given, and he asks for also another blessing, which his father gave him. But he was so angry, and this is the point in chapter 27, that Esau hated his brother Jacob, and because of the blessing wherewith his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, the days of mourning for my father at hand, then I will slay my brother Israel, or Jacob. Remember, Jacob becomes Israel in history. And so this is a start of a perpetual hatred between Esau and his brother Jacob. And we go on to read in verse 35, because thou, Esau, has had a perpetual hatred. This is the point, and that word perpetual means a hatred of old. Ezekiel was written centuries later, but the hatred was still there. And this is what Ezekiel recorded, because thou, Esau, has a perpetual hatred and has shed the blood of the children of Israel by the force of the sword in the time of the calamity, in the time that their iniquity had an end. And that fight between two brothers is still going on today through their descendants. And so, in a sense, we haven't got time to look at it all today, but Edom eventually went to Mount Seir in Petra, the city of Petra, and eventually the Romans destroyed the city. They migrated south of the land of Israel and became the land of Edom. And after that happened, there was a famine, and some of them went and became part of Israel, accepted the Jewish faith, proselyte Jews. Some of them migrated into Asia Minor, above Israel, okay? Malachi, even though it appears that Esau's finished with, the prophet Malachi, the last book in the Old Testament, makes it clear. And Israel was complaining because the Jews had lost their vision towards God. And so they're complaining. And in the first chapter of Malachi, the last book in the Old Testament, God says, I have loved you, saith the Lord. He's talking about Israel, or Jacob. And you're saying to me, how have you loved me? Because we're in trouble and we're not surviving as well as we should. And God says, was not, and he brings him back to the beginning, was not Esau Jacob's brother, saith the Lord, and yet I proved that I loved Jacob? And I hated Esau because of his attitude and his ways. And I laid his mountains and his heritage waste to the dragons or the reptiles of the wilderness. And this is a reference to God arranging for the destruction of the city of Petra, or Mount Seir, where that Esau dwelt. And that's a story in itself. So God is reaffirming two things here. One, I love Israel. Israel are my people, and I hate Esau descendants because they don't have any value or belief in the God of Israel. So it tells us here that wherefore Edom saith, he says, we are impoverished. They've been into the land of Edom, scattered now in this time of history. As I mentioned, some went into the land of Judah and even into Jerusalem and accepted the religion for their own survival. Others went north, mainly to Asia Minor above Israel. And so it's prophetically telling us that Edom or Esau was impoverished. They were poor. But we will return and we're going to now build the desolate places. And thus saith the Lord of hosts, and they shall build, and they will build up again as a great nation of people in identity. But ultimately, I will throw them down, God says. And they shall call them the border of wickedness. Just remember that, the iron curtain, the border of wickedness. And the people against whom the Lord hath indignation forever. And so God realises and knows the prophetic message that's going to ultimately take place. But what he says, the ultimate proof of all this is one day when the Lord will fight for Israel in the battle of Armageddon. Your eyes shall see, the prophet Malachi wrote, and you shall say that the Lord shall be magnified from the borders of Israel. This hasn't happened yet, but this is where we're heading in history. So we go to Ezekiel 38. And in Ezekiel 38, we read here the identity of Gog and Magog. Remember we read that before. Son of man, this is just a reference to the prophet Ezekiel. He says, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince or ruler of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. So here's the word of God. I want you to prophesy, Ezekiel, against Gog in the land of Magog, and say that I'm going to judge them. So, thus saith the Lord, I'm against thee, and make this point very clear, that God is against the Gog, the chief prince or the ruler of Meshech and Tubal. So we've got two names here we identify, Gog and Magog. Gog is the ruler, and Magog is the land. If we look at even some history, Bible history, Dr. Schofield wrote many decades ago about the Northern Confederacy of Ezekiel chapter 38. And Dr. Schofield stated that this is a primary reference to the Northern European powers headed up by Russia. All Bible scholars in his time realised that Gog is the prince or the ruler and Magog is his land. And it goes on to talk about the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Now, Meshech is the ancient biblical identity of Muscovy that became Moscow. And Tubal is known as the city of Tobolsk, today on the Baltic Sea. And it brings out the point here, it's a clear mark of identification of the nations, according to Schofield. The Amplified Bible, at the bottom of Ezekiel 38, says, Gog is a symbolic name standing for the leader of the world powers who are antagonistic or don't believe in God. Meshech and Tubal are understood to have been the same as Moshi and Tiberni of the Greeks, the tribes that inhabited the regions in the Corsica Mountains. Rosh, because in the original it says the chief prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, which is not in King James. But Rosh, which some would identify with Russia, must have designated a land and a people somewhere in the same quarter. And therefore the Gog of Ezekiel must be viewed as, in some sense, at the head of the high regions in the northern part of Asia. Asia here is Asia Minor, not as we know Asia today. So it's very sort of clear indications. Another one is William Smith's Dictionary of the Bible, again written decades ago. Rosh was forenamed 2,500 years ago as Russia today. This early biblical notice of so great an empire is doubly interesting from it being a solitary instance. No other name of any modern nation occurs in the scriptures. It can be identified as one we're talking about today. Fairbairn's Imperial Standard Bible Encyclopedia and Unger's Bible Dictionary says that ultimately there's going to be an invasion of Palestine, which of course is where Israel is, by a great northern confederacy ostensibly led by Russia. And it says the scene depicts a gigantic outburst of anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish feelings and a colossal attempt to overrun Palestine with the goal of annihilating the Jews. And again, these things were written decades ago, before all the troubles in the world today. And like we mentioned that when the land of Edom fell apart because there was no food, most of them moved up above Israel, you can see at the end of the Mediterranean, and the names that are referred to them, Togarmah, Gomer, Magog, Gog, and all that, and Ashkenaz, these are places that literally exist in this ancient Bible map. So that's where they were, but they're going to inhabit the desolate places, as the scriptures tell us. But when does the stage get set for the final conflict? We have an exact year. The year is 1917 AD. And of course, this is the time of the fulfillment of the 7 times punishment, when, of course, the children of Israel were allowed to, from that moment, start to return to the land of Israel. The Ottoman Empire of the Turks, which had ruled the land of Israel for 300 to 400 years, was defeated by the British Allied forces. And even before they won, the British Parliament made a declaration. It's called the Balfour Declaration. And under the Balfour Declaration, which was read on the day when Lord Allenby of Megiddo walked into Jerusalem and made this declaration, and it says that the Jews could go back to Israel as their national home after 2,520 years. Time in the Bible is 360 years, 7 times is 2,520 years. And we can have and know that the captivity took place when Nebuchadnezzar attacked in 604. You add the 2,520 and you come to exactly 1917 AD. And that's when the Bible fulfilled the promises that it made that Israel will be restored to its own land. And that's when it began. But what is doubly interesting is that there was another revolution that took place in that particular year. And in 1917, there was the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And that was led by Lenin and Trotsky. And as a result of that, and we'll see a little bit more in a moment, the army was given the colour red by Trotsky and identified eventually the colour of the nation. And remember what we said before in the prophecies in Genesis. Esau is Edom and Edom is red. This nation became red from the time of Lenin and Trotsky. Vladimir Lenin. What is interesting and fascinating is that this man that led the Russian Revolution of the Bolsheviks was in actual fact an Idumean Jew, an Esau Jew. He's better known by his alias, which was Lenin, but his real name was Vladimir Ulyanov. And he was a Russian revolutionary, a politician, and a political theorist. But one of the things about this man, which is in line with Esau, he was militantly an atheist. He did not believe in God. And so Lenin and the Communist Party, the first thing they did in Russia was to demolish organised religion. And in 1918, the government decreed a separation from church and state. And when the Russian Revolution took place, it forbid religious instruction in schools. Now that's rather interesting. And you know, for 74 years, from the time of Lenin, there was no churches in Russia. And eventually the people wanted to believe in God and did believe in God, and they formed the Russian Orthodox Church, which is not based on the Bible principles, really. But this man, Vladimir Lenin, has become like God to the Russian people. That's what he looks like today. He's in a mausoleum in Red Square in Russia, in Moscow, and he has been preserved since his death. And they treat it every so often, but he's in a mausoleum with controlled atmosphere of temperature and air and all the rest of it. And so we see here that his name was Ulyanov. He was an Ashkenazim Jew, an Esau Jew, and along with Trotsky and 5 others of the Politburo, they formed the United Soviet Socialist Republic, or the Communist Party. And others were part of the Jewish descendancy that were in that original program. Trotsky, whose real name, as we're going to see in a moment, is Bronstein. He also was an Idumean Ashkenazim Jew, and he formed the Red Army. And he was the one that gave the colour red to the nation. And here's the man here, Lev Davidovich Bronstein. That's his original birth name, a Jew. He was known as Leon Trotsky. He was the leader of the Red Army. He gave the colour to the army. And so the Bolsheviks, in common with other socialites, regarded religious beliefs as gross superstition, and they were determined to eliminate it by a combination of repression, ridicule, and scientific enlightenment. That man gave the colour to the nation. And even today, flying up above Moscow at night, there's this gigantic red 5-pointed star, the colour of the red star and the colour of the nation. But history also tells us that, as we know, that the aim of the Russian Revolution and the ultimate aim of communism is to put the hammer and the sickle across the face of the whole earth, as you see on the right-hand side. Lenin was an internationalist and a keen supporter of world revolution, deeming that national borders to be outdated, a concept, and nationalism a distraction from class struggle. He believed that in a socialist society, the world's nations would inevitably merge and result in a single world government. The difference between communism is that they want to rule the world where Catholicism also wants to rule it. And there is a scripture in Ezekiel 34 that I will turn thee back and I will put hooks in thy jaws. In other words, there might be a time in history when Russia will try to get involved in the international scene and move forward, and something will pull it back. In 1962 was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the people who were in power at that time were President Kennedy, John Kennedy, Khrushchev, and Castro in Cuba. And what actually happened was that the Russians sent ships down to Cuba with missiles in them. And they were going to take them to Cuba and point them at America as a threat. There was no war then, but President Kennedy sent them back to Russia. He actually sent the American Navy out, intercepted, I should say, the ships, and said, you go back to Russia, we'll blow you out of the water. And not only that, any weapons you've got, missiles in Cuba, get them out of the country so there is none there. And they did it. And so that's putting the hooks in the jaw and pulling them back. The time wasn't ready for an attack. So this is what it brings out here. So it was to prevent the Soviets from delivering additional missiles and military equipment to Cuba. And so the destroyer comes in. And we're going back now to Ezekiel 38 and verse 9. It says, "For I will raise and cause to come up against Babylon a great assembly from the north country. And they shall set themselves in array against her, and she shall be taken. And their arrows today we would call likely missiles that shoot through the sky. When they send these arrows out, these missiles, they'll be like a mighty expert man, meaning a mighty destroyer, and none will return in vain." And there's a front cover magazine from the Time magazine showing the bear. This is, I think, back in 1979. And the bear is facing and looking at the Middle East. So history is going to repeat itself because the same symbols were used back in history. Ancient Babylon was a symbol of a lion with eagle's wings. Modern Babylon is Rome. And the insignia of the Pope, I don't know what he uses today, but in the past, his own personal flag is a lion with eagle's wings. Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, in Revelation chapter 17. And on the other side, ancient Babylon was destroyed by the bear. And the bear was Medo-Persia, Cyrus and Darius. Today, the bear is Russia. Revelation chapter 18 tells us that in one day and 1 hour, Russia is going to destroy Babylon, Rome, in 1 day and 1 hour. You read it in Revelation 18, which is a separate subject. But history is going to repeat itself, ultimately. And bringing it in line with the reference we've made to what happened in the past of these people, in Jeremiah 50 it says, "I will raise and cause to come against Babylon," which was the lion with eagle's wings, "an assembly of great nations from the north country." And Medo-Persia came from the north. "And they'll set themselves in array, and from thence she shall be taken, and their arrows or their weapons will be of a mighty expert man, and none shall return in vain." In verse 16 it says, "Cut off the sower from Babylon, and him that handleth the sickle in the time of harvest, for the fear of the pressing sword, and everyone shall to his people, and they shall flee everyone to his own land." And then in verse 23 it brings in the hammer. How is the hammer of the whole earth? In other words, the world that then was, and even to now, the world that will be. Cut off, asunder and broken. How is Babylon become a desolation of the nations? And from the time that the Medo-Persian people destroyed Babylon, it's never been inhabited, the city of Babylon again. It's just a ruin. God destroyed it, and it's finished. And what it's really saying is that one day it's going to happen when modern Babylon is attacked and will be no more. How? By the hammer and the sickle. In verse 7 of Ezekiel 38 it says, "Be thou prepared, and thyself and thou and all thy company," or in other words the great confederacy, "that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them." And of course the guard is the Iron Curtain. As right from the beginning, Russia identified and kept their own within their control. The Iron Curtain is described as the political, military and ideological barrier erected by the Soviet Union after World War II to seal itself off in its dependent Eastern and Central European allies from open contact with the West and other non-communist areas. It was called the Iron Curtain that Russia put up. But it tells us that not only is this great confederacy coming down, ostensibly led by Russia, but other nations are named here that will fight with Russia against the land of Israel. Persia, Iran, Ethiopia, and Libya. All of them with shield and helmet. In other words, they're ready to do battle. Gomer and all these bands in the house of Togarmah of the northern quarters, and all his bands and many people with thee. Gomer refers to the old regions of the Slavic areas of Europe, and of course Togarmah of the northern quarters of the northern parts of Asia, which identifies China and the likes of North Korea and people like that will and are already siding with Russia. Many people with thee. And it tells us that thou, Rosh, which is the identity of Meshach and Tubal and Gog and Magog, will come out of thy place from the northern parts, and thou shalt come against the mountains of Israel that have always, which have been always waste, and they'll fall upon the mountains of Israel. A land that's, as we see here, brought back from the sword people, which was the Ottoman Turks, gathered out of many people, in other words, from many nations of the world, and brought forth out of nations. And that's the way that the world is set up at the moment. In a sense, we're waiting for Ezekiel 38 to be more fully brought into being. This is an ancient map that shows these people here. The land of Magog is Russia. Tubal is the city of Tobolsk. Rosh is a name for Rus or Russians. Togarmah, over to the side of the Caspian Sea, which is, of course, the likes of China and the allies there, and, of course, Turkey, we've already described. And there's Libya, and there's Persia. And, of course, up in the top there, all these nations are going to come down, as the Bible describes it, like a cloud to cover the lands. Very clearly identified in the scriptures, even in our generation. And so that's how the picture will look. This little nation of Israel, at the end of the Mediterranean Sea, they want to wipe them out. And so Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya, and with them, with the great confederacy of the north, is going to attack the land of Israel. And when you shall see, the Bible says here, Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation is near. It's all going to happen very, very suddenly. We read in verse 8 of Ezekiel 38, and after many days thou shalt be visited, in the latter days thou shalt come to the land that's brought back from the sword people, the Turks, which is Israel, and gathered out of many nations against the mountains of Israel. They're going to fight, which have always been waste or unproductive, but is brought forth out of the nations, because they've come from all around the world back to the land of Israel. And they shall dwell safely, all of them. They have done an amazing job for a little nation in just surviving. And that's really where the conflict at the moment between the Palestinians and the Israelis is. Israel's fighting for its very existence. And it's no wonder they're fighting like they are in that regard, regardless, even though we'd all agree it's terrible, the atrocities that have happened even from both sides. But what it tells us that when they come and they ascend, they're going to come like a storm coming across the land. And they'll be like a cloud to cover the land. There will be that many people with their bands and many people with thee. This is talking about with Gog and Magog attacking Israel. a band of armies that the world has probably never seen. And even Ukraine's president, we had a talk to the Israeli parliament, and he said to the Israeli parliament back in 2022, the Russian invasion is an all-out war destroying or aimed at destroying the Ukrainian people. And this is why it resembles what the Nazis did to the Jewish people during the Holocaust. And he pointed out to them, Zelensky, that after us, you're next to the Jews, to the land of Israel. And interesting, Zelensky is of Jewish origin. But Vladimir Putin has made it very clear in recent times. He talks of nuclear power as he tells the West to back off over Ukraine. The big thing he says, I want to remind you that Russia is one of the most powerful nuclear nations. And this is reality, this is not just words. And recent estimations back in 2014, so we've come a fair few years since then, Russia had a total of 1,800 operational nuclear weapons and a further 7,000 stockpiled. And like I mentioned earlier, they're now working on miniature nuclear bombs to put on drones. And so Putin is looking to China for assistance during the invasion of the Ukraine, according to US reports. Kim Jong-un in North Korea offers Putin support with the supply of weapons and of missiles. The interesting thing is their colours are red. So the Middle East is in conflict. We've known that for a long time. And this is an old Time magazine front cover. But the message is, should the world be afraid? Yes, they should. There will be a conflict. The final battle is over Israel and the city of Jerusalem. And the book of Psalms is already the psalmist wrote 3,000 years ago. And they have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation. This is a prophetic message, clearly, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. That's the aim. And then in verse 85 of Psalm 83, they've consulted together with one consent or an agreement, and they are a confederate against them. And that's what is referred to in Ezekiel 38, a confederacy of nations that's going to go against the land of Israel. But as they're planning the attack to come down and attack Israel, verse 11 and 12 bring up another interesting point. Thou, talking about Gog and Magog, shall say, I, the Russians, will go up to the land of unwalled villages, and I'll go to them that are at rest, which means dwelling safely and confidently. They don't have bars nor gates. They don't have walls to protect them. They've never been fortified. And the reason they're going to go up and attack this land of unwalled villages, remember this is written 3,000 years ago, approximately, a bit less. They want to take a spoil from this country they're going to attack. They want to take a prey. They want to turn their hand upon the desolate places that for centuries were never inhabited, and upon the people that have gathered together out of the nations. A country that's very cosmopolitan, with all the nations make part of it, but they're rich. They've gotten cattle and goods. And that's part of Ezekiel 38. As they're attacking Israel, they're going to go up. There's only one way up from Russia. That's over the North Pole. The Americans know they've ever attacked by Russian missiles, they have a maximum of 25 minutes. That was then. They're probably faster these days. They know that. And they have actually stationed in Alaska at the top of that screen there. They have spy planes in the air the Americans 24 hours of the day, watching for an attack to give them an opportunity to counterattack anything that comes in over the North Pole. I'll go up to the land of unwilled villages. I'll go to them at rest, safely dwell because they're in control. They have neither walls nor bars nor gates, and they're rich, and we want their riches, their goods and their cattle. To take a spoil, to take a prey, the desolate places, as America's not old in history, they gather other nations, their rich cattle and goods. But then it mentions some others in the ultimate end. It talks about Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish with all the young lions thereof. And we haven't got time to go into it all, but Sheba and Dedan is a reference to the Scandinavian countries, the Vikings and the like, that eventually came or originally came from the land of Israel. And the merchants of Tarshish is the old British merchant navy. And the young lions are the Commonwealth countries. So it's saying here Scandinavian countries, Britain, and the young lions, the Commonwealth. The great lion, of course, is Britain. And they shall say unto thee, art thou come to take a spoil? Thou hast gathered thy company to take a prey. And again, even with the others that are there that are going to side and help in the ultimate conflict with Israel, they want their cattle, their goods, their silver and their gold. Now, talking about going up, one of the things that's happened in recent times is the likes of this over-the-horizon radar that is now stationed in the Russian Arctic region. For the past decade, 10 years, Russia has systematically expanded and strengthened its military activity in the Arctic region, bases, airfields, large-scale radar installations, as well as defensive and offensive weapons. That's the radar. An article said that along more than 6,000 kilometres of Arctic coastline, Russia has modernised and expanded their military installations. New bases, new facilities, airfields, etc., including the Barents and the Kara Sea, and the proximity to the Northern Fleet headquarters and so on that we're reading here of the Russians. And the Barents Sea serves as a passageway in which Russia's large fleet gains access to all of the world's oceans from up the top by the Arctic. Much of Russia's strategic nuclear assets are concentrated in the Kola Peninsula in the Arctic at the top above Russia. So, what does God do about all this? Because we're coming to a bit of a conclusion now. It says that it shall come to pass at the same time when God is coming down against the land of Israel, that God says, my fury will come up in my face. For in my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath have I spoken. He says, truly or surely in that day there's going to be a great shaking in the land of Israel. So ultimately, God is going to stop the war. That's what it's really telling us here. It's like we read of in Luke 21 about the powers of the heavens one day will be shaken. There'll be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, and upon the earth there's going to be distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear, looking upon those things that are coming on the earth. For the powers of the heavens are going to one day be shaken. And when it talks about perplexity, it means there's no natural solution. It's going to happen. No natural solution. The powers of the heavens are going to shake the earth in that regard. In Zechariah, which is a whole prophecy in itself, I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. And the city, Jerusalem, will be taken, the houses rifled and the women ravished. Half of the city of Jerusalem is going to go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. So some will remain under captivity, others will be taken away in captivity. In other words, when the war starts and the Confederacy comes down, Jerusalem is going to be attacked and they're going to start losing the war big time. And we read here in verse 22 of Ezekiel what's going to happen, because that is not the end, but it will happen. Jerusalem will be taken. And it says, I'll plead against him with pestilence and with blood, talking about Gog and Magog and the ones that are with him, and I will rain upon him. This is what God says, and upon his bands, and upon the many people that are with him, an overflowing rain and a great hailstones and fire and brimstone. God is going to deal with them well and truly. Thus, he says, as a result, I will magnify myself and sanctify or set myself apart, and I'm going to be known in the eyes of many nations. And the one thing this world is going to ultimately know, God says, I am the Lord. And I'm above all the people in the nations of the earth. God will magnify at the end his name. But there's even description of what happens after this battle called Armageddon. We read here, it'll come to pass, in Ezekiel 39, that in that day I will give Gog and Magog and the great army, a place of graves in Israel. The valley of the passengers will be on the east of the sea, and you shall stop the noses or the mouths of the passengers, and they shall bury Gog and all the multitude of soldiers that fight and get destroyed. And they're going to be buried in a place called the Valley of Hamon-Gog. Hamon-Gog means where the multitude of Gog will be buried. A very special mountain, or a valley of Hamon-Gog. And it says they're going to be 7 months after the final conflict of cleaning up. The house of Israel will be finding all these bodies and bones, and they're going to bury them. It'll take a solid 7 months after the destruction. They may cleanse the land. Yeah, and all the people of the land shall bury them, and shall be for them a renown in the day that I shall be glorified, saith the Lord. They'll be able to praise me and understand. Excuse me. But even then it goes on. It's not just for that 7 months. It says they shall sever off men of continual employment. In other words, there's so much to do about burying them. And passing through the land of Israel to bury the passengers, which means the strangers that remain on the face of the earth, to cleanse it. After the 7 months they shall still search for any bones or pieces. And the passengers that pass through the land and see if a man's bones, then they'll set up a sign or a stake beside the bones, so the buriers will find them and take them and bury them in the valley of Hamon-Gog. So that's what they're going to be looking for. Revelation 16 tells us the name of the battle, just in the summary. The Lord says, I come as a thief, meaning a thief in the night. It'll suddenly happen. But the ones that are prepared are the ones that are going to get the great benefit out of what we're talking about, like ourselves. Blessed is he that watcheth and keepeth his garments clean and righteous. It means walking in the Lord. Lest he be found naked, in other words, exposed by his sin, and they shall see his shame. And so ultimately it talks about this battle taking place. He gathers them together in a place called in the Hebrew tongue, Armageddon. As we know, the name of the final battle when this confederacy of Ezekiel 38 come down is Armageddon. But it also tells us in the same chapter there'll be 3 very unclean spiritual effects in the world at the time of the end. They're symbolically like frogs. One, the mouth of the dragon. Secondly, the mouth of the beast. And thirdly, the mouth of the prophet. These 3 evil influences will be in the world at the time of the end. The dragon represents atheism and unbelief that's in the world. The beast represents Roman Catholicism, and particularly the seat of Rome. And the mouth of the false prophet is identified through the Muslim and Muhammad believers, the false prophet. But he's going to defeat them all. And like it tells us further in Luke 21, they shall see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. This is going to be a most amazing day. The screen of the heaven is like the heaven is like a screen, and from one side of the earth to the other, every eye shall see it. When these things come to pass, look up, for your heads, for your redemption or salvation draws very nigh. And the words of Jesus, for as the lightning cometh out of the east, shineth right across the heavens to the west. That's what it's going to be like in the coming of the Son of Man, or the return of Jesus Christ. And all the people said, Amen. All right.